thanks very much for coming along. Welcome to the Sheffield Documentary Festival panel on games for social change. My name's Jason Hall. I'm here from Screen West Midlands, which is the regional screen agency in the West Midlands. My interest in this whole area really, my role as Head of Innovation for Screen WM is to look after the Channel 4's 4IP fund within the region, which, if anyone's not already familiar with it, highly recommend taking a look at 4ip.org.uk. And essentially, this is nationwide a £50 million fund that Channel 4 is investing in public service content across digital platforms. So that includes everything from online works to mobile works to games. In the West Midlands in particular, we have a lot of work and activity in the whole area of games for social change and serious games. There's a £7 million Serious Games Institute in Coventry, and a whole bunch of companies who for many years now have been working very strongly within this whole area. And given the possibilities in serious games and games for social change, it's an area that 4IP is particularly interested in. We've got a fantastic panel here today. Before we go through to hear from some of those during the course of the next hour and a half, just to kind of set the scene a little bit, and before I came to the session today, I did a little bit of reading around and seeing how can I introduce this session. I came across an article which I'm sure you may have seen this week this was particularly in the Times Online, about the value of the games industry in the UK generally, which this year, for the UK alone, it's looked to take over the total combined value of both music and video, DVD, and what have you. The games industry in the UK is going to be worth £4.6 billion. It's a phenomenally successful and hugely, hugely important industry. Now, interestingly, there was a comment underneath the article from a man, funny enough, from Sheffield, a guy called Martin Line. Is he here in the audience today? No, just thought I'd check. Who'd said, the article had started off by using the old cliche of games being all the preserve of spotty teenage boys, and he'd taken exception to this, quite rightly, and said that computer games are an interactive art form that are at best underrepresented and at worst misrepresented, often tackling adult or important themes. Then he kind of ran out of space in the comment box and said, these boxes need to be bigger. So essentially, the panel session today is to provide a bigger box to talk about the issues all around games and games of social change and what can be done with them. We've got some fantastic people on the panel today, and just to prove the point that games aren't all about spotty teenage boys, we'll kick off with Suzanne, who's neither spotty nor teenage, nor you'll surely have noticed a boy. So please, Suzanne is here from Games for Change, come from New York, which is a fantastic organisation dedicated towards supporting this whole sector. So Suzanne, if you'd like to kick off. Thank you.
I actually am a teenage boy in Second Life. Does that count? So I'm Suzanne Stegerman with Games for Change. And I'm going to level with you. I have both the most miserable migraine happening right now, and I also get a lot of anxiety before I talk. About an hour or 2 hours before I get on stage, I sort of freak out. And then I have to stop and I have to say, it's not about me. The people on the panel, it's not about them. It's about the ideas. And there are some really amazing ideas, as we've been hearing a lot through the festival here, and also you'll be hearing on stage today. So I'm going to talk to you about this idea, which is actually my favorite idea, and an idea I believed in for a really long time. And I'm going to talk to you about this idea, and I'm going to let you know why it is such a good idea, and then I'm going to invite you to get along, to get involved. But first, before I do that, I want to just tell a story. I was a documentary filmmaker myself. Growing up, I was always interested in meaningful media, and I used to listen to Bob Dylan, and I would... This not working? This is working. I was interested in the intersection of these two things, pop culture and meaningful messages, throughout my entire life. Bob Dylan, there's a TV show in the States called MASH. I'm not sure if any of you know about it. Even The Simpsons has some interesting things going on. So I've always been sort of shaped by these meaningful media experiences. So when I got out of college, I felt I had to go work for public television. That was where it was most meaningful. So I went to work for PBS and worked with Ken Burns and a bunch of other people. And I was working on a PBS show called Frontline, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a social issues documentary show about this guy. Can anyone recognize this guy? Anyone know who this is? No guesses? David Duke, this lovely fellow, David Duke. I'm surprised you couldn't tell. So obvious. So I was working on a Frontline on this guy, and the editor in the suite next to me said to thank me for my work on my last day, sort of gave me this floppy disk. This is the early 90s. I'm sure I'm dating myself, but it was the early 90s, and I was a 20-something. That's when I'm dating myself. And, you know, I put this floppy disk video game. Who cares? Put it in my pocket. Was going upstate for a big party, as 20-somethings do. And that night, got upstairs, was, you know, getting undressed or getting dressed for the party, and came across this floppy disk. And I thought, well, you know, I've got a few minutes. I want to avoid helping people in the kitchen prepare for the party, so I'm just going to sit down and play this for a few minutes. And it was, and I didn't get up for 6 hours, and I missed the party entirely. And as some people in the room know, I actually don't like to miss parties very much. And it was this game called Hidden Agenda. And it was a game about Central American politics. And this game was the single most transformative media experience of my life. I had been hearing on the radio and TV and newscasts about the Contras and the Sandinistas, and this game was about Central America without being specifically a news event. It put you in the role of a dictator in this fictional country called Chimerica. But many of the issues were similar, and it really engrossed you and immersed you in the content in a way I had never had before. And I was able to put a Christian Democrat as my agriculture minister, and I was able to put a communist heading my defense, which I don't recommend, by the way. And, you know, it was very, very powerful. And I thought, wow, like, where have I been? These games are amazing. And I think this is more interesting than some of the films that I've been working on. So where can I find more games? So I went to the game industry conference called the Game Developers Conference, and I went looking for these games. I was calling them meaningful games. I thought maybe I would find, you know, some people in the corner of my tribe with, you know, ponchos and like socks and Birkenstocks, or I don't know what. So I was looking for my tribe, and I didn't find them. They weren't there. This was an anomaly of a game. There were a couple of others that were made sort of in the late 80s, Balance of the Planet and Balance of Power, that were similar about real-world issues, but they hadn't taken off. And a couple of things I did learn in the game industry. One was that it's a pretty risk-averse place. Games are very hard to make. They are very hard to make money on. 80 to 90% of all games fail financially. So, you know, they are doing a really good job of making entertainment games and not taking many risks. They do entertaining games incredibly well, but they can't innovate that much because it's hard. So that's one thing. The other thing I learned was that there was no line at the ladies' room. And this was really important to me. I thought, maybe I could stick around here for a while. And then the third thing I learned, which is perhaps the most important, is that games are a young medium. They're really a medium in their infancy. And they are often misunderstood, as many media in their infancy are misunderstood. And I'm just going to show you a couple examples. Books, says Voltaire, are making us all ignorant. The written word is, as you can read, deluding people that they have wide knowledge. Well, they are, in fact, incapable of real judgment. That's the written word. Novels. This is my favorite one. A diminution of happiness. Don't read Moby Dick. Film, for those of you in the audience, robbing our children of creative ability. So you get the idea. I'm going to just give you a quick overview of some of the early media models. This, Ned Kelly's Gang, as some of you may know, is often considered one of the very first films, feature films. And it's an hour and a half of cops and robbers, basically. I'm going to take a coughing drop. Not again. All right. This is TV. This is the early web. Pornography. Some early video games. Who can tell me what game this is? Very good. I'm all right. I'm going to go to someone else and then come back to me.
Okay, well,
It gets much better, I promise you.
we'll tune in for part 2 very shortly. Is anyone plugged in, ready to go? David? Okay, right. We'll flip over to David Squire from a company called Desk. And before we do, and as we're switching over, let's do a quick check in the room here. How many people in the room here is a filmmaker? Okay. How many people in the room would call themselves a gamer? Substantially fewer. Okay, here's a question for you. How many people have ever jostled in position to try and grab a seat ahead of the next person on a train or a bus? How many people have indulged in office politics, where they perhaps tried to score points off their colleagues in order to gain a level up by winning a promotion with their boss? How many people have tried to find a parking space in the city on a Saturday afternoon? If you've ever done any of these things, then I've got news for you. You are a gamer. You know, games do actually actively infiltrate every part of your life. You just don't realize it. The experience that you're living in is just so immersive, you don't realize you're playing a game. And because you don't realize you're playing a game, you don't realize that you're actually learning and adapting your behavior for the next time you play the level. So that, I suppose, is what we're here to talk about today. You know, how can you make a game so immersive that you learn and adapt your behavior through playing it? Ready, David?
Yep.
Right, okay. With that in mind, here's David Squire from Desk. Desk, in fact, do you want to tell us what Desk do, David?
I can tell you
Great.
that. Hello. Luckily, I haven't got a cough yet. I'm going to split this talk into kind of 2 sections with a kind of sandwich in the middle. That's the prawns, if you like, in the sandwich. Prawn sandwich. So the prawn in the sandwich is stuff that we do about learning games, and the bit at the beginning, the top slice of the bread, is stuff to do with what's a name, what are games, and blowing some misconceptions about what they are. And then a little bit at the end of a deconstruction about kind of what's going on, what's all the fuss about, okay? So this is who I am. 2 parts of my life. The majority, almost 99% of my time is spent doing work with Desk. I'll tell you what that is in a minute. And then 1%, but a pathetic 1%, is research fellow at the University of Bristol, looking at games and learning and how the 2 things comply, which is this interesting idea that I've been obsessed with for a long time, but not as long as Suzanne. I didn't mean that to be rude. Sorry. Thank you. We've known each other enough. So the interplay between games and learning, which I'll explain a little bit more about, and you can go look at my website and yada, yada, yada. This corporate slide. So we, the company, like maybe most of the people who are in this kind of space, don't necessarily make all their money. I'll mention money a couple of times. From making games. There's not a great deal of money in it so far yet, yada, yada, yada. So we produce e-learning content, training materials for government clients and media clients, as well as then producing games. And where those 2 meet is the most interesting thing for us. And I'll keep going as quickly as possible because I don't want to miss kickoff. There you go. So first bit, what's in a name? What are all games about? Games are like a box of chocolates. You don't know what you're going to get. Okay, and there's a massive misconception. Everybody thinks games are Grand Theft Auto. Even if you don't know what Grand Theft Auto is, mostly people think it's a shoot 'em up. And mostly people think shoot 'em ups are shooting. Actually, they're not. There's a lot of shooting in shoot-em-ups, but it's not all shooting. So, in an attempt to try to bridge that gap between traditional media and new media, as we like to call it, we don't call it old media too much. But games are like films. Not everybody likes chick flicks. I like chick flicks. I like rom-coms. I've got a big collection of everything that Meg Ryan's ever done. And I like DVDs, and I remain, I reserve my right to be passive. I like consuming and being immersed in an experience. But games are varied, and they are like films. I like films. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything unless you say what the kind of films you like, or I'm sure you're aware of it, mostly if you're working in factual documentary stuff, that's very different to making quiz games, quiz shows. So the current state of play within the games industry, the entertainment games industry, selling enormous, vast quantities of 40 quid AAA titles, is that at the moment it's dominated by those kind of big, powerful people called Sony and Nintendo. Nothing wrong with Sony and Nintendo, love them, especially Nintendo, but that's what we are dominated by at the moment. And that's kind of, there's been a comparison with gaming and games industry based on the kind of filming, the development of film. So basically where we are now, theoretically, is around 1920s, 1930s, where Hollywood was making 800 films a year, 20 studios. And it's very similar. At the moment, you've got a big thing called EA, although they laid off 500 people last couple of days, but they big powerhouses that make most of their games, and Nintendo and Sony control the whole kind of thing and are very conservative about their brand. Which means that you have a perpetuation of a number of myths about what games are and what's in games. Generally speaking, because they're selling to other people who play the same kind of game. Hence why there's an obsession about orcs, elves and goblins. And, let's face it, there are quite a lot of games with that feature characters with unfeasibly large breasts. Let's call a spade a spade. The reason for that, I considered, this is my considered opinion for the reason for the unfeasibly large breasts, is that there's a degree of adventure and fantasy that games need in order to perpetuate what they do and carry their experience. And I'll explain a little bit more about the kind of academic process that's going on underneath the games in a minute. There is another reason why that is the case, is because generally speaking, we all like to dress up from now and then. Every time again, we just like to pretend to be something else that we're not. In a sense, this whole thing is a performance. We all like doing that. That's the interesting thing about what happens here in gaming, is that it's part of that experience. You're not, you are you, but you're not you, which is kind of different to older media. So this is the bit in the middle. I think in this kind of space, these kind of things are fringe. And Susanna, hopefully, when her cough gets better, will tell you more about the kind of fringing stuff and the kind of Sundance equivalent that I think we need over here, and we haven't got in the UK, is like an art house movie system to distribute and channel interesting games outside of the mainstream stuff you get in game shops. So what we do as a company is try to put those two things together and build stuff that has, basically games with a learning intent, some value to it. Not the kind of, there's lots of other theories, using civilization. Civilization has a degree of history in it, supposedly, although actually the history that it's based on is highly dubious, to say the least. But the idea we try and do is to build games that have some intrinsic educational value, learning value, even if that isn't necessarily sold straight to the audience up front. This is based on, and this whole system that we produce and the kind of things we do is based on this principle. This is borrowed from James Paul G, which is good game design is good learning design, the other way around as well. Okay? So just 3 very quick examples of the kind of things we've done in the past, just to sort of put it into some kind of context. LifeQuest is a large role-playing game, isometric engine role-playing game that works online, that delivers a big question: what is it like to be a human being, from a variety of faith perspectives, aimed at primary school age kids. and this was commissioned and made by the BBC for a project called Jam. May it rest in peace, because it's now sunk and is sitting on a shelf in the BBC offices, and we're hoping at some point, this may well come out in Wales first, interestingly enough. Don't ask, well, you can ask me if you really want to know, but it's coming out in Wales, and we hope will come out beyond that. Another game we've done is called Doomed. You can play this as long as you've got a game called Half-Life 2, and this is a mod game that we've done that involves science embedded into a first-person shooter game. And that's purely on the basis of, it's a research project at the University of Wolverhampton, based on the fact of we just picked the most controversial game that we could think of and tried to put learning into it, rather successfully, we would like to feel. And the third one is another example of a gaming process and education. Healthy Island is a thing that we've got in development as a prototype at the moment, which is aiming at interactive whiteboards in primary school classrooms as a reward system and an interchange system where these little creatures in a virtual island die if kids don't eat better food and don't take exercise. So that's in development at the moment. So to the last third, the slice of bread on the bottom. What's all the fuss about? What's all this kind of, other than the fact that they're selling music and video games, what's all the fuss about? Just two ideas that are worth picking up on. And there's a kind of, for television audience people, a kind of a summary of what we think is good in terms of gaming and immersion. There's a website that we've done that kind of tries to explain some of the things that are going on there. So one idea is immersion. Immersion, kind of, I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of immersion in traditional media. Immersion in our world is a kind of halfway in, halfway out process. Eric Zimmerman, who's a kind of guy who does a lot of theory as well as making games in the States, calls it the fallacy of immersion. But the idea is you kind of know that you're in this world and you're kind of involved in a virtual world, but you kind of, at the same time, you're in control of it. You know that you're not. It's more complex than a straightforward thing where you sit and you forget time when you're watching a film or having something to it. You're in and you're not. The other kind of academic process that's going on is a thing called agency, which is fundamentally you're in control of what you're doing. You call the shots, you make the decisions, and most games, good complex games, give you a whole range of options and ideas to play with. They're not a linear experience that takes you from A to B. You go from A to C to Z to Z, all over the place. Finally, two things to remember. One is the new media world, including games, is a very rich, drenched, complex space. Social media, all of the things, all the pictures here were made by people on Flickr, which is a photo sharing site that I participate in. It's rich and it's exciting, and most people under the ages of certainly 25 are in some shape or form immersed in that complex world. That's one thing to remember. The second thing to remember, I hope, is economics rules absolutely bloody everything, does it not? It rules the your world, it rules whether you're going to get a commission, and it rules games. It rules the industry, it dictates what comes out, it dictates releases, it dictates whether or not there's a business here at all. And that's the second thing to remember. Two websites, desk.co.uk. Desk.tv is a thing that kind of is there to try and help you explain, trying to us explain to you the kind of things that we think interactive media and gaming stuff is. It includes ARGs, it's just some examples, not all our stuff, some of it is ours, some of it isn't. Come on Wednesday. Big game today against Doncaster Rovers, and you can contact me there if you want to talk anymore.
Thank you very much. Contact you there at Sheffield Wednesday, the football ground? Presumably not.
Yeah, if you want to come.
Can we switch over and we'll head back to Suzanne in just a moment. Just to let you know that we will have time for Q&A, I would hope, at the end of the session. So if you could save up any questions for any of the panellists for the end of the session, just to keep things moving along at a nice brisk pace. Just as we transfer over, David, can just quickly ask you, actually, an awful lot of the games, particularly in the education space, seem to be very much kind of focused on a younger demographic, you know, pretty much sort of kids up to teens. Is that because you think a lot of the funding, that's where the funding is coming from in terms of BBC, CBeebies, Channel 4, Matlock's education budget, or is it that's genuinely where the audience is?
Both.
Do you think there's a... God damn! Stop asking closed questions. Do you think there's an opportunity to break out and actually reach more the demographic we're looking at today?
In the same way that the games industry is beginning to get away from orcs and elves and gobbledygooks, yes, casual gaming, Nintendo, family stuff is leading that way, and they're vaguely interested in other demographics. Basically, it will die off if it doesn't, and they're beginning. Sony and Nintendo are beginning to be aware of that fact. If they don't start attracting other audiences to other experiences, then it will die off. Because the hardcore gaming thing that you need 40 hours of commitment to even get anywhere, and 2 to 3 hours to even start playing a game, is hardcore gaming, and it can't survive like that. So absolutely, yeah.
Thanks very much. Suzanne, ready? Yeah. Okay, let's continue with part 2 with Suzanne Segerman.
So now I'm just going to get into the boring statistics part of the talk, but they're really actually pretty interesting. 70% of all Americans play games of one form or another, and the average gamer, as David mentioned, is not in the basement anymore, or maybe I can't remember who mentioned that. Everyone's playing, from soccer moms to teens on their cell phones, rivaling Hollywood box office for the first time the last couple years. And it's a little bit like documentary film in the 60s and 70s, or film in general in terms of its cultural place, is that games are really becoming meaningful culture. They're becoming accepted as part of this, almost high art in some ways, like film did, being collected in museums for the first time. There's a museum in New York that's collecting games as cultural artifact. Artists are using games, and games have been in the Whitney, for us in the States, they've been in the Whitney and the MoMA as contemporary arts, and universities are using games for serious game studies programs. I like to say that if film was the, sorry everybody, but if film was the dominant cultural form of the 20th century, then interactive media is that of the 21st. So one last, oh no, it's not the last long slide about statistics, but very briefly, this just came out a couple weeks ago. 97% of teenagers are playing video games. And that's across the board. That's not just rich kids, that's everybody. So you're really reaching underserved audiences with games, which is really interesting for social issues. 2 most popular games are not violent. Heavy gameplay is not related to decreased civic participation. In fact, there is correlation between increased civic participation in games and outside. Though I put the chicken and the egg there because they don't know where that starts. So if you're falling asleep in this talk, this is the one slide you have to pay attention to, and then you can go back to sleep. If you look at a tic-tac-toe board, and you're from another culture or another planet or whatever, you don't know how to do this. There's nothing in this that tells you what to do about this piece of information. The first thing you have to do in a game is learn something, the rules. The second thing you have to do in a game is learn how to win. The third thing you have to do in a game is learn how to get better. Games are environments for getting better at things. They are the single best learning tool you have out there. I really believe that. And I am not the only one. There's actually a lot of new research. In the States, the MacArthur Foundation has launched the Digital Media and Learning Initiative, $50 million initiative, looking at digital media and how that's affecting young people and learning. I could spend an hour on this slide. I will not. But at the end, and David touched on a couple of these ideas there too, but at the end of that hour, we would come up together and understand that games are a perfectly designed learning environment, which is something a MacArthur representative just said recently. I got it on tape. I do want to pull out 2 things. It's always good to pull out 2, isn't it? Something about that. 2 different things from what David talked about. In terms of social issues, these are 2 very important one more. Good old tea, you know, I'm in England, I have to have a lot of tea. So, games let you try on new worlds and take on new perspectives. That's what's so great about games. Flying an airplane, shooting a gun, traveling to magical worlds, having powers you don't normally have access to. And perspectives. What's it like to be president? What's it like to be God? What's it like to be a president who thinks he's God? Sorry. He's gone now, so I can say things like that. So the second thing, this is the one slide I like to read because, from my notes because it's really important. Systems, complex systems. Complex problem solving. Many experts in my field would say that games are fostering a new kind of system, a new kind of thinking. It's called systems thinking. The ability to understand and manage complex systems and solve problems within those systems. There are already gamers, companies who hire gamers, top-level gamers, and they're not game companies. They hire gamers for their unique and evolving abilities to manage systems and to solve problems from a systems perspective. Leading educators in the field say that systems thinking is a key to facing 21st century challenges. Perhaps parents should worry less about their kids playing too many games and worry more that their kids aren't playing enough of these new games. Well-designed games with learning objectives and real-world perspectives, applications. Sorry. My husband works with the Secretary General of the UN. The other night when I was preparing my talk, I asked him, what are the two things that you think are most important when you're thinking about global problems and solving them? And these are the two things he said. The ability to see another side's perspective and the understanding of complexity and interrelated nature of problems. So if we toggle back for a sec, games are really good for letting you try on someone else's perspectives, and they're good for solving complex problems within a system. They neatly match up. So, you know, Darfur is not just a genocide. It began as a conflict between farmers and herders over increasingly scarce water. Climate change, tribal politics then entered in. Any global issue has to take account of water, politics, development, economics, and peacekeeping. Black and white thinking, as we know over in our country, is not going to help us solve problems. So, who gets it? Oops, supposed to stay there. Who gets it? Okay, someone in the audience tell me, what major institution, I'm talking from a US perspective, but what major US institution, probably British as well, is the first to understand and employ technology for their own purposes? Anyone? Military, very good. So, at least in our country, military is using games a lot. This is just one example. It's called America's Army. It's the #1 recruiting tool they use to recruit people into the Army in the US. It's also one of the top 10 first-person shooter games, given away for free. None of the others are. Very effective. Social change, that's a social change game. Sorry. Okay, so what we do at Games for Change, we're a nonprofit, and we're supporting this emerging field and this new movement. We think of ourselves like Sundance, supporting, don't make the games, we're just supporting them. We have lots of stuff I'll tell you about very briefly. And I also say I'm the transformative voice for the power of video games. I talk to the press a lot. I go speak at conferences and things. And here is someone else with a bigger production budget than I am telling my story.
From ABC News headquarters in New York, this is World News.
And Games for Change, the popular new video games designed to save the world. And coming up after a quick break, it sounds like a computer programmer's fantasy and a parent's fantasy as well. Video games that do good. Video games are often accused of wasting time or even promoting violence, but there are some popular new games that have a pretty lofty goal, saving the world. Here's ABC's Andrea Canning.
Please, I'm your officer in charge for this World Food Program mission. Our job is to do an aerial assessment to get an accurate picture of the food crisis.
Your mission in the new video game Food Force? To save millions from starvation in the war-ravaged nation of Ceylon.
You can see there will be no harvest this year.
Shaylon may be fictitious, but its problems aren't. The video game has been downloaded 4 million times, and it's one of dozens of socially responsible games bringing issues like the environment and the Darfur crisis to your fingertips. Getting involved is part of the game.
Survival of the camp is also assisted by you spreading the word about the game and about Darfur.
Think of the concept as the opposite of the ultra-popular and ultra-violent Grand Theft Auto.
We think games have the potential to have a positive and powerful impact on society. Games are really good for exploring complex social issues.
And there's no issue more complex than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So former Israeli intelligence officer Ossi Borak created Peacemaker. Gamers can attempt to achieve Mideast peace by playing as the Israeli prime minister or the Palestinian president.
You can actually dive into a situation and make decisions. I mean, this is very, very powerful.
At this institute in Tel Aviv, they use Peacemaker to help Israeli and Palestinian teenagers understand the conflict better.
I played in the Palestinian side, and suddenly I saw what is going on in their side.
Great. So, we do this basically by bringing people together. Nonprofits, educators, they all have different things they bring to the table. The two groups that are in the room probably most today are documentary filmmakers. We think of you probably in the activist artist category, and then journalists in the media. So those of you who are actually funding and supporting new social issue media models. We invite you both wholeheartedly to join us in making these new kinds of games. We need your help. So what do? We have an annual festival now in its 6th year. We have a one-on-one workshop, basic, very, very basic, and a toolkit that's given away for free to help people learn how to make these games from leaders in the field, people like Eric Zimmerman, who you mentioned. A lot of people come from around the world to help us train people how to make these new games. Lots of online resources, a lab at the new school. As I said, I talk to the press all the time, get the word out about games. And we are two policy things. We're supporting open internet and Corporation for Public Gaming. How can you get involved? Lots of ways. Make a game. Filmmakers should think about when they're making social issue documentary to actually include a game in their project. Lend your expertise. A lot of you are content experts. And on the other side, we have the media companies who have lots of expertise and funding and visibility and distribution. So there's a lot of ways that you could really get involved in this. Come to our festival. Of course, we always need you to introduce us to our rich friends. I cannot have to add that in there. And come to our site and play the games. There are a lot of games up there, including this game. So who cares about this? Our partners, for one, some very high impact partners we work with. Microsoft has worked with them on a contest on environmental games, the UN, AMD, a lot of different places, Knight Foundation. So lots of press. These games get a ton of press. So every time you make a game about Darfur, Darfur gets more ink. That's almost going to be true of almost any game you make on a serious issue. They get press, at least for the next few years. Who cares? This is the most important. So 4 million players are playing Food Force, 100,000 players in Middle East alone. Force More Powerful is a training game to train activists in the field that's getting across the borders in places that people can't get to train activists. Darfur is Dying has 3 million players, and it's got real-world actions, including letters to Congress. So there's real impact here. So I just want to end with this very special moment. You must be scratching your head right now, right? What is this? This is our honor. Americans would recognize her. I'm not sure how many British people will. One of our Supreme Court justices, Sandra Day O'Connor, former. And you think, what the heck is she doing at a video game conference? Well, she's making a game. She had learned that the typical teenager could identify an American Idol judge sooner than they could a Supreme Court justice. And she decided that she was going to make, and she also, she did her research. From what I understand, she's pretty good at research. And she decided that a game was the best way to engage and immerse young people in the issues. And it's a game about, it's a realistic simulation of government. It allows young people to explore the civic environment. So don't listen to me, listen to her. She's way smarter than I am. Thank you very much.
Suzanne, fantastic. We're going to move swiftly on. Are you plugged in, ready to go? Right. Okay, just as we switch over, I'll introduce you to Mikkel Lucas Overby from the Serious Games Interactive in Denmark. Mikkel can tell us a lot about the work they do, including a couple of the games that Suzanne's mentioned, Global Conflict Palestine, and the newly launched Global Conflict Latin America. What strikes me as being particularly interesting is there's already a few parallels coming up here between the independent and particularly documentary filmmakers and games designers working in this space, and we'll see more of that as we go on. So I suppose the way to think about it is if you look at how a lot of video community groups sprang up in the last 10, 20 years and what an effect they had, and how you can use video as a tool to educate people or to help people develop their social skills or confidence or what have you. And only now, really, is this starting to infiltrate into government thinking, into school curriculums, and you're seeing media literacy more and more coming into schools. So clearly there is a big challenge. If we're only now realizing the power that video film has for that, how long is it going to take us, Suzanne, do you think, before games has a similar kind of respectability within government and within education? Something to think about for the end of the session. But let's introduce Mikkel. Mikkel, do you want to tell us about Games for Social Change and your own company, Serious Games Interactive?
Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me, having me here. I'm representing a game based in Denmark, Copenhagen, called Serious Game Interactive, and we do serious games, and I'm going to tell you a bit about what that is through the presentation. The way I structured it was actually to approach the three questions that were raised in sort of the outline for this panel: whether games can make a difference, whether they have an audience, or social games, and the opportunities for documentary makers in terms of using the games media. So that is sort of the overall structure of my presentation. I actually have the same example as Susanna has, America's Army, for illustrating that games can actually make a difference, whether it's a good or a bad. It's, of course, a matter of opinion. But it's a pretty blunt statement, this one, and it says that if it wasn't for America's Army, there would not have been a war in Iraq. And the basic background is that...
Who said that?
Sorry?
Who said that?
It's in a new report by Forrester Research on serious games. Wow. It's not scientifically backed up, but the idea is that the US Army experienced extreme recruiting difficulties. I think it was in 2003, 2004. They launched America's Army, a shoot 'em up, or at least a training game for soldiers, which became extremely popular among the target audience. They quite quickly got 7 million registered users that had spent, I think after a year, 23 hours in average on playing the game. So that's a pretty significant amount of hours. I think that's approximately 160 million hours playtime within that short period. So it's a pretty impressive result.
And people below the draft age, too.
Probably also that, yeah. At least it indicates that the games, the serious games, the learning games, has some kind of potential, and how you sort of choose to use that is, of course, up to you as an organization, company, or an individual. So I'm going to tell you a bit about who we are, what we do, why we do as we do, and then some brief comments about documentary and games. We're a relatively small company, funded in Copenhagen, Denmark. We're 14 people today, sort of a very broad and diverse workforce. We have, of course, game programmers, game animators, designers, and on top of that, we have a journalist, an author of children's books. We have 1.5 psychologists. We have an economist. So it's a very sort of diverse workforce that actually puts our productions and titles together. We focus very much on this combination of playing, learning, and storytelling, which we believe is also sort of part of the Nordic tradition, the Nordic learning tradition in terms of also storytelling. What we aim to do is create these enriching and engaging game experiences based on cutting-edge game research. We're very closely affiliated with both the IT University in Copenhagen in terms of the technical development and also the learning parts, and also the Copenhagen Business Schools in terms of actually trying to make some money out of it, as is one of the challenges here. So what we do, I have a trailer which I would like to show you. It's very brief, and hopefully it pops up here. Here we go. And this is actually our newest title, Global Conflicts Latin America, that was released in last week. So this is, thank you very much. I want to play the camera right now, actually. This is our newest title in a game series that we're doing called Global Conflicts. And we did the first title, which came out last year, called Global Conflicts Palestine, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is actually pictures from our research archive, where we've been a very happy user of documentaries as well. And we've used that to actually make a game about the conflict, which we are selling to primarily educational institutions throughout the world, but also to the private market, to consumers that are just interested in games and the social change movement. A bit of facts about the game series. It focuses on conflict zones throughout the world. The whole idea is that we would like to develop some kind of matrix where we have geographical regions. So we've done Palestine, we've done Latin America now, and we're in the process of doing Africa. So geographical regions, and then certain themes running through the games. So that can be about terrorism, it could be about pollution, new democracies, whatever kind of relevant topics that we find pops up. I think serious games has a huge potential. That said, the money is not quite there yet. We've sold Global Conflicts Palestine in more than 50 countries. I think at least 5 of the countries it's a single copy. So the spread is high, the spread it's broad, but the volume is not really getting there. We're seeing educational institutions beginning to pick it up. We've sold actually the game to, I think it's a bit over 10% of all Danish schools. So that's of course our home market. We're moving into Sweden now, and slowly the UK and also Germany.
Do you have curriculum with it?
Yes, we have a sort of a learning package that comes with it, with teacher manual and curriculum mapping. But in order to get it all running, we as other players in the industry, we also do sort of more consulting-based work. So we have our flagship titles, which is the Global Conflict series at the moment. We're also developing a new series called Playing History, where we focuses on key historical events. But what actually makes sort of the real go around at the moment is our client projects, which we're doing for corporations, training games, learning games. We're doing them for museums. We're doing games for 3 Danish museums at the moment. The Danish Broadcasting Corporation, we've done 2 games for them. And these are actually where the profit is coming from at the moment. Although the flagship titles are beginning to catch up a bit. So why do we do it? We of course, I mean, we're a company, so we of course have a sort of a shareholder value perspective to take care of. But beyond that, we actually think that the games media has a huge or significant potential that has not really been realized yet. And I think the American Army example shows that you can actually mobilize force and mobilize people to engage in a certain topic. And if you can do it, if you can make people actually go to war, I believe that we can also make people interested in human rights violations. In this case, it's Palestine. It could be pollution in Latin American countries, or the use of child soldiers in Africa. And of course, there's a lot of other important issues that we would love to engage with, and that's, I guess, also why we are very happy to have the dialogue with filmmakers and other kind of media. What we emphasize a lot in our games is that we try to actually show that there's not really one truth. So you sort of have to go all the way around. You have to talk in the Palestine game to historians, you have to talk to Israeli settlers, Palestinians, whether they are martyrs or terrorists. People can make up their own mind. But actually force people, in order to get the highest score, to go sort of all the way around. And I think the strength about the game media here is that beyond actually hearing and seeing about these conflicts, they actually placed within the conflict and experience what it is like living in a conflict zone. And that's what we're trying to explore, to utilize. I think sort of the stereotype gamer, we have killed the myth of a teenager, but this is also just some numbers to prove that. Then I thought a bit about the differences between documentaries and games, and I should say that this is highly simplified, and I'm a big fan of documentaries, and this might seem a bit, simplified is probably the best word. Well, what I sort of see from my perspective is that documentaries focuses on reality. You target viewers, it's passive reception, more or less, it's a linear story. Typically there's a single consumer in front of a television screen, perhaps 2 or 3. And there's a relatively low degree of repeatability. So that means that one single user will probably see a documentary one time and perhaps a couple of times if he or she really likes it. And I think the interesting thing about games in that respect is that it's not really reality that you're seeing, it's scenarios. We don't have viewers, we have players, and that means that it's actually people actively engaged in the game that make active choices as well. It's an interactive media. We can allow for multiple users actually playing and engaging in the same game. And there is a high degree of replayability, so people actually play the same game for hours and hours and hours. And I think that there lies some highly interesting opportunities at the interfaces of these two genres or media that sort of begs for investigation. So to round up, I think the serious games market represents a highly interesting market with numerous opportunities. It is not really heavily exploited yet, but I think it could be, and I think that it complements the documentary genre very nicely, and vice versa. I think it's highly interesting to think about sort of the history of new developments that actually happens at the interfaces of new, or the interfaces of different markets and different industries. And I think that the documentary and the games market actually could be an interesting place to explore this further. We're interested in it, so if you're interested, please let us know. Thank you.
How do you make a living from something when people fundamentally are not willing to pay for content? So again, something that we can perhaps explore later in the session. Simon, we ready to go?
Yeah.
Right. Let's hear from Simon Bennett.
Hi, as Jason said, I'm Simon Bennett. I'm the director of Rolling Sound and Roll 7. I think I planned for a half-hour speech as opposed to a 10-minute one, so there's going to be less of a sandwich and more of a fast food drive-through PowerPoint of how I fell into serious games, and there might be some interesting things that you can pick up from that. I actually come from an education background. I run a company called Rolling Sound, which works with young people around London and the UK. We are London's largest youth multimedia training company on the outreach side. We actually have grown over the past 5 years from 2 of us in a bedroom to 100 of us in offices all around London. Started off with music as a colleague and I with a guitar and a couple of laptops teaching sort of music to young people in youth clubs, and it's now grown to sort of 7 different disciplines that we teach. The main thing that we're focusing on today is obviously the video game design, which is the core course that we now teach. In fact, it's actually superseded everything that we teach. It's the most engaging course that we now run because young people can just sit on a computer and get involved, and I think that's something that we've been sort of discussing is how engaging it is as a medium. The majority of the courses we do are NEAT, so it's not in education, employment or training, so it's the young people who are really hard to reach. That forms the majority of our work. We also work in schools. We do courses with youth offenders, youth community workshops, and we also run sort of special projects. So one of those special projects is called The Lab, which we launched a couple of weeks ago, and we put a high-spec multimedia studio in a London bus, which now travels around Lewisham trying not to get shot at. Video game design. We started video game design 2.5 years ago. It was actually a bit of a blag. Someone said to us, could you do, along with your music course and your film course, could you possibly do a video games course? My business partner stupidly, well, actually in hindsight it was a good option, but said yes we would, and he found a program and we scouted round for someone to teach it. The course has now been running for 2.5 years, and it's been such a success. 2 of the young people on the course came to us and said, could we possibly do a computer game around knife crime? So we said, yes, let's do that. Let's see if we can find some funding. And we found a small amount of funding. I think it was about £15,000 from an organisation called MediaBox. Some of you might know about it. It was a fund for young people to get involved with companies and create a final piece of media. So we made Soul Control. It was a fully youth-led project which young people engaged with from various different disciplines. We had young people making music, we had young people doing the programming on the game, and we had young people making cut sequences in film. I'm not going to go too much into Soul Control because it's not actually the most important part. As we had a lot of press and we had a lot of people come to us saying that it was a fantastic way of working, actually using young people to create content and specifically socially responsible games. So we set up Roll 7. We invested quite a substantial amount of money from Rolling Sound to, one, offer young people actual work opportunities, and 2, to try and close the gap between serious games and AAA titles. And I think for the first time that's actually been done by the gentleman to my right, and I massively applaud what you've done with your latest game, the Latin America Global Conflict game. So that's our kind of remit. We were taken on by Channel 4 straight after the Soul Control game finished. They were doing the Disarming Britain campaign, which some of you might be aware of, and they wanted something which would sit alongside the campaign online to engage young people as part of their overall marketing campaign. So we developed a computer game called Dead Ends, and used the young people that we'd worked with on Soul Control, but paid them for the work and they had to fit 4 of these objectives. So we had to engage young people with it. We had to reach these audiences, opportunities for scripting, and actually creating sort of the game with their own media. So I'm just going to sort of describe some of the development process because it might be interesting from a sort of film point of view. There was a lot of research, obviously, and requirements gathering. We actually spoke with the Met Police and people like that. We only had 6 weeks to create this game, which was a challenge. Yeah, a challenge, should we say? I don't know whether I don't know what the sort of lead times are for films, but they're not that short. And I don't know how long a game should take. Maybe
more hours at least.
Yeah. Okay. So we had 6 weeks to deliver, and so we worked with our young people to identify some gameplay, some elements. Working on devising the storyline. We then worked with a company called Backwater in London. They're a production company, and they basically have a couple of writers who are working with us to sort of develop the story alongside our young people. They then reviewed it and sort of added criticism and feedback, which then went back to the production company, and that kind of went on and on and on for about a week or two. And then the final script came back to our young people who turned it into street speak, so sort of made it more relevant. Everything that the guys had written was probably sort of in the way that I'm speaking with you now, and if I were to sort of translate what I was speaking to you now, it might be slightly incomprehensible. So we created some content working with young people from Rolling Sound. They work on our one up scheme, which is offering them work experience and paid sort of jobs. They have skills in the things that we need to create games, so they work with our professionals. One of the guys, Ben Geist, had done some work with us at Rolling Sound, really wanted to get involved in some modelling and texturing, which is creating the assets for the actual game environment that you would play in. So he took some photos, created a model in Maya, mapped using a UV mapper. I'm not a techno guy, so I'll just shrug on that one. And then we import it into an engine that we created for it. So the project outcomes, Channel 4 accepted it, which is nice because they hadn't actually guaranteed that it would actually go through. So we've had 10,000 downloads, which compared to the millions that we've been talked to earlier, not massive, but it was a short project and hasn't had the publicity that some of these other projects have had. Ben now works as a tutor for Rolling Sound, so he's got a job. And James, who was doing some Q&A, continues to do so, and we've actually got him work experience at EA. Ollie, who's got a bit of a blue patch on him, has actually got a full-time job with us at Roll7, working on sort of various different projects, which is nice for him because he wasn't doing anything before. And the game itself was played in citizenship lessons in South East London as an opportunity to as a kind of catalyst to sort of inspire discussion around the issue of knife crime. I'm not going to go into the game itself. You can actually pick up a copy of the game. I'm going to show you a quick video about the project that kind of explains it a bit better than I can because I'm a bit jittery today.
We're looking at ways of engaging young people, and we're really excited about working on a sort of socially responsible game.
Computer games are often blamed for their negative effect on young people and society in general. And the Dead Ends project was a great opportunity for young people working on it to turn that on its head and use computer games as a communicative tool for a socially responsible message.
This is where we start.
Dead Ends is a computer game that we produced with a team of young people from all across London, and it was made for the Channel 4 Disarming Britain season. And really what we wanted to do was to use the format for computer games to try and engage young people, really looking at why street crime and knife crime is on the rise in London, and what young people can kind of do to try and stop it.
kids don't want to be talked at, which a lot of grown-ups do to kids. And I think maybe a computer game, which every kid loves to do these days, is a better way of getting through to them.
Step off, G. People are going to know your name, fam.
For a lot of the young people, this will be the first time they've actually worked as a team to share ideas, concepts and creativity. It's a great opportunity for them to give their opinions on what they think is right, what they think is wrong, what they think is realistic.
I'm Christopher Andrade, and I played the role of Jay in Dead Ends.
And what are you doing, bruv?
The whole process of getting into the character and then seeing yourself on the game as a totally different person. It was exciting.
What was great about working on using Maya and that for Dead Ends was just that I got to see a whole new side of games. Like I modelled pretty much a whole level by myself, and I just got to see like how hard it was. I didn't actually realise it'd be that hard, but it was still great fun. My skills have just gone up in Maya, and it's just been a great experience. The thing I enjoy about games design is just challenging yourself constantly. Just let yourself get better.
Name's JJ, I'm a DJ/producer from East London. My involvement with the games, I produced 3 tunes. One was the lead theme and 2 others which we used throughout the game.
I think it's given young people the opportunity to work in an industry kind of way as a traditional music producer. I don't think they've ever done that, so I think it was a challenge.
Working on the games actually gave me more of a feel to how the mood of a tune can also adapt to the mood of actual real life situation. It gave me a big challenge actually creating music for our games. I never actually have done that before, and I've got to say it's a big experience for me. I learned a lot.
A group of London teenagers has produced a computer game warning about the dangers of knife crime.
So what do the people it's aimed at actually think?
I think it will help get the message across about like knife crime, gun crime and gang wars and stuff like that.
I think computer games are a fantastic means of communication. I mean, everybody plays them, and I think they're a terrific way of getting a message through.
Games are a really involved way of engaging people. The game, I think, will bring the Channel 4 season to a wider audience.
Well, the project's had a really big impact in a lot of ways. The game itself has been downloaded about 5,000 times now, so we know that a lot of young people have played it, which is fantastic. But also for the young people who actually took part in the project, they've all developed really good skills a lot of technical skills, in sort of areas related to games design. And in fact, some of them have now gone on to actual jobs in the games development industry.
That's now 10. So just really quickly, what's next? We are looking at developing a game called Red Mist, which is an MMO, a massively multiplayer online, which is set in a prison, which would also act as a cognitive behavioural tool for youth offenders and at-risk young people. Can't go into it too much, but just very quickly, we're looking to work with some technology called NeuroSky, which is a neurofeedback tool, and we are sort of developing concepts around that at the moment, and working with DigiMask, which allows a player to take a photo of the front of their face and the side of their face, and it automatically be included in the game. So it's actually about getting yourself into a game. So that's me. I look a bit like the guy from Lord of the Rings, actually. But anyway, that's about it. That's how I got into it. It's been 6 months of chaos, and I'm sitting here now. It's a bit odd. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Simon. Moving swiftly on, because we are running a bit tight on time just now, but if we can introduce Margaret Robertson, and then we should hopefully have time for a very quick Q&A at the end of it. David, I know, has to rush off bang on 2:45 because he's got a very important event that he needs to get off to that I wouldn't dream of intruding upon. But let's introduce Margaret Robertson. And Margaret, tell us about yourself and what you do, please. Are you ready? Ready to go. Let's go.
Hello. I'm Margaret Robertson. I have a slightly different background from these guys. I started out as a games journalist and now work as a games consultant. And I think where my experience is different from what the panel so far has talked about is that I very firmly have a foot in both camps, in the mainstream entertainment games industry and in the social game space or the meaningful game space, persuasive, serious art games, whatever that whole emerging category is. And I thought, to kind of give you a sense of how schizophrenic that makes my life, it might be worth kind of running through the projects that I've worked on over the last year. So these aren't necessarily things I can be particularly explicit about because there's all kind of NDAs, but to give you a flavour of the mainstream games that I worked on in the last year, the first big, expensive title that I worked on that's kind of looking for a big audience was substantially about shooting aliens in the head. Then I did a bit of time on a project where you collect toys, spent some time casting spells. Then, you know, because it is quite a diverse industry, I spent some time shooting zombies in the head, which is a great game, actually. But, you know, there is some innovation. I don't want to undersell the games industry. Fantastic amount of attacking law enforcement officers in a way that will prejudice their parenting possibilities. But by the end of the year, it was all right because I was back to shooting some more aliens in the head. Whereas for the social games that I was working on, the kind of agenda of the stuff that I went through over the course of that year was a project about online safety for kids, one that looked at helping people understand the effects of mental illness, both on the people who suffer from it, but also on the people who live with those who suffer from it. We were looking around the Olympics about whether or not we could use a game to sort of illuminate more about what living in modern China is like. Project that was hoping to encourage people to make their own films, something on 18th century social history, and a hugely ambitious project that's looking at tackling all different kinds of discrimination in a very interactive setting. And so you would think, looking at those two lists, that when I've got my mainstream hat on, I feel like I'm wasting my life. And when I've got my social hat on, I feel a bit smug because I'm doing all of these kind of worthy, worthwhile, interesting projects. But really what it's highlighted for me is that although we spend a lot of time talking about these games that are conceived to enact social change, sometimes we don't spend enough time acknowledging the fact that games already are social change. All of the stats that you've been shown today of the millions of people that are playing, the penetration that gaming have, and therefore the thousands of millions of hours that people spend on games, they're already producing drastic changes in how people live, how people think, how people spend their time, how people socialise. Now, these are kind of issues that have become quite popular. They've gained a lot of currency of late. People spend a lot of time talking about online games like World of Warcraft and all of the different human interactions that you can model within them. You have epidemiologists looking at Warcraft, you have economists looking at Warcraft, you have anthropologists looking at Warcraft. It's a hugely fertile, interesting field. That interests me a little bit less because what Warcraft is just putting a bunch of people in a room together. It is a virtual room, but it's still just a room, and we've known for thousands of years that interesting things happen when you do that. And I'm also not interested today in talking about entertainment games that have been co-opted to be used in social or meaningful ways. There's a whole raft of games like Civilization, like The Sims, like Myst, that are now used in classrooms for purposes other than those for which they were originally conceived, to work as educational tools. Now, I want to talk about big, dumb, stupid video games, like Ocarina of Time, although anyone who loves it as much as I do would be a bit cross about it being called big and dumb. Absolutely. So this was one of the first mainstream entertainment games that made me realise that even these products have the power to change how you behave. And this actually isn't a shot from the game, it's a dreadful, dreadful piece of art representing a particular section called the Water Temple, which is a legendarily difficult spatial puzzle. That provoked people all over the world, myself included, to produce documents like this, which is a painstaking map that somebody made a decade ago and has kept for a decade of this terrible, terrible conundrum. What I love about this is if you find the file online and you look very closely, you can just see through the other side of the paper is his maths homework. So, I mean, that possibly is the only slide that I need to put up in terms of communicating the interrelationship between these things. And what's interesting is that this wasn't accidental. The man who designed this game, who's a legendarily well-respected game designer called Shigeru Miyamoto, has spoken since about how he specifically designed this puzzle to be too hard for one person to solve on their own. What he wanted to do was create a situation where people would have to go to school or go to work the next day and ask their friends for help, to compare notes, to say, I tried this, did that work, what did you do, I've got this far, and to start evolving their own mechanisms in terms of their own social life, in terms of their own creative life, to kind of move through this conventional game that looks on the face of it to be, you know, one of these dumb sword and sorcery, nothing interesting there games. And I think when you start thinking in those terms, you find throughout the history of entertainment games all kinds of mechanisms for social change. The thing that probably had the biggest impact on me personally was that I was very privileged to be a foot soldier in probably the greatest conflict my generation lived through, which was the Atari Amiga wars of the early 90s. Now, being a right-thinking human being, obviously I was an ST person, but we were very much in the minority, probably because the ST was a bit rubbish compared to the Amiga, but we would rather die than say that. And this culture that existed around these machines fundamentally changed my school life, because it changed who I spent time with, it changed the subjects that I became interested in, because I was co-opted into this community. People I never had spoken to before would find me in the queue before physics to give me these precious piles of contraband discs, because we were all part of this plan, we were all part of this community. And having been kind of primed by that experience to find and kind of recognize and articulate these elements within games, all through my gaming life, I keep finding kind of similar elements. So even in something like Mario, again, a brilliant game, but surely utterly banal, as there's nothing in there, you jump on Goomba's head. When you talk to people, you find these incredible stories about how they have impacted their social lives or their familial lives. So I have a friend who has two youngish children, kind of about 7 and 10, and he bought them a game called New Super Mario Brothers to play on their DS, hoping that it would kind of kindle in them the love that he had for this game growing up. But he was very disappointed to discover it was really too hard for them. They would keep getting stuck. And he thought, well, this is a disaster because they're going to get frustrated. They're not going to enjoy the experience. And he kind of resigned himself to this not being a successful experiment. And the kids went off and they got interested in something else and they were doing their own little projects and all the rest of it. And then about a week later, they dug the game out again, played it for a bit, got stuck again. And at that point, they vanished from the room, sped off, and came back bearing the fruits of their previous week's work, which was the Mario crown, which they came and ceremonially placed on their dad's head because he was King Mario, because he was the guy who could do the difficult bits. And it became this whole family kind of bonding experience that they would play on their own as long as they could and then have to go and get the crown and get him to come and help them through the next bit. And it took something which, on the face of it, is a single-player, traditional, entertainment-geared computer game and turned it into something that was an opportunity to change parenting dynamics and is kind of really interesting. And you find all sorts of really unexpected elements like that. This is Kalik the Blood. This is one of the worst games ever made. It was an early PlayStation game. And it's a jumping off point for one of the most embarrassing stories I've ever had to tell in a speech, which is that a long time ago when this came out, so kind of however long that was, 13 years ago now, I was playing it with an old friend of mine, thinking this is the most kind of brilliant, extraordinary pinnacle of human achievement ever. But watching him play was miserable, because he was really just trying to brute force his way through. He wasn't very good at it, kept dying, kept saving, restarting. He'd kind of lurch forward in these kind of 4-second bursts of progress, trying the same things over and over again, just really, head down, miserable kind of approach. And I suddenly found myself thinking, I bet he's hopeless in bed. Which was not a thought I expected to have, and I would like to state very, very clearly that it's not something that I can verify one way or the other. But I suddenly realized that actually there's all kinds of personality markers that come through when you play games. And you can draw all kinds of conclusions from sort of about people's level of patience, people's levels of creativity, people's capacity to deal with failure, all kinds of possibilities. And I have to say, if you have anybody, perhaps at this conference, who you are curious as to whether or not there might be a future for you. I recommend you set them up on Super Puzzle Fighter. It doesn't, on the face of it, look like it has anything to offer. It's the most conventional game you could imagine. It's another gem buster, totally derivative. There's no story there, there's no depth, there's no meaning, except if you sit and watch somebody play for an hour, you will know everything you need to know about the decision that you might want to be making later in the evening. It really does work, I do promise you. And you keep finding these things. In all my gaming life, you meet them over and over again, and I've got 1 minute left. Resident Evil, all about resource management. Hate the games, very bad at them. One of the reasons I'm bad at them is every time I finish one, I finish it with a stockpile of 1,000 green herbs, 1,000 health sprays, 40 shotgun shells, because I over-ration. And so this game has now become my own personal touchstone for managing my own personal finances, because I have a bad habit of over-squirreling that this has helped me kind of adjust. Same with the Final Fantasy series. This to me is a game that is all about failure, because it teaches incredible lessons about perseverance, about clarity of thought, about cool-headedness. And so suddenly, that kind of dichotomy isn't there, because it's not a question of the entertainment games that wasted my life and the social games that taught me things. It's about the fact that all of these games, all of my play experiences have done something incredibly profound that it's easy to feel stupid talking about, but that I can't get away from. This is, you know, decades of my life and tens of thousands of hours, and I can't ignore the impact that this has had on me. So that dichotomy, actually, that CNN report set up beautifully between social meaningful games and kind of GTA 4 style games, and encouraging you to see them as opposites and almost as enemies, I think is overly simplistic and is a little bit dangerous, because hopefully what that's kind of given you some insight into is that for me, from my experience and for many millions of other players, those mainstream entertainment games aren't about zombies and aliens and necessarily kind of casting spells. They're about all of these really, really big issues that affect everybody and that we need to always find new ways to explore. And actually that aligns perfectly with many of the kind of categories that we would be looking at reaching in these games. And those lists could extend into kind of total perpetuity. So with my foot in both camps, I just think it's really important that we don't underestimate the interesting social impact that mainstream games are already having, and don't set up this false dichotomy that mainstream games are all fun and no learning, and social games are all learning and no fun, because absolutely, as Suzanne was saying, all games teach, all games have an impact on the people who play them, and plotting out that full territory is something that we're only in the very, very earliest stages of, both in the social space and in the mainstream space. And that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have time? 5 minutes for Q&A. Can I recommend anyone who's got questions for Dave, let's get them off first, because I know he needs to rush off. Any questions at all from the audience?
Great.
See you, Dave. Any questions generally for the panel? Okay. Do you have a mic here at all? Or?
It's a question for two panel speakers. I came in late, so I didn't catch the second speaker's name here, and for Margaret at the far end as well. It's basically about boring, straight question about the market sales of serious games. Yeah? The question is it, what do you think could be done, or what will happen to make these games sell much more to the direct public? Is it as simple as better production values, more investment in it, or is there something more profound about the nature of serious games which makes that problematic in some way?
Well, I would just say that, is that on? No. Doesn't matter. Oh, there it is. We're really at the beginning of this. So the games that we see, the ones that we've seen in our community, like Food Force and Darforce Dying, IET, that have really taken off, have been incredibly well-designed games by game designers. A lot of times people get into this space saying, oh, we're a nonprofit and we have some really smart people who understand interactive design, and they're going to make a game, and they make a game that's not really well designed as a game. So the most important thing is that we don't keep making more bad games. That we have to hold up, and that's one thing we try to do really well with our awards, is to say these are well-designed games. And then, once those sort of take root, obviously 4 million players means it's a good game. People are playing it. How to monetize that is trickier. I mean, we're building relationships with some of these game companies, but it's going to be a long road, or road to hoe. They have to recognize that there are audiences like Myst, which broke out beyond the gamer community. Somebody's going to take a risk, and whether it's going to come from our community, we have some social entrepreneurs who are looking specifically at a double bottom line model for games, or some dedicated person at the top of one of these game companies who decides, I'm going to take this risk. I mean, I just heard, a couple months ago from 8 fairly, established EA players who are EA employees who are making their own game company for environmental games, specifically because they're so hell-bent on doing something about the environment. And they're still working at EA, but they're building this company, and they're soon going to start. So it's happening. It's just very much at the beginning.
Mikkel, can you bring in your own experience here? Because it strikes me that here again there's a direct parallel with documentary film, and that the traditional thinking around documentaries is that they're not necessarily commercial, that they're generally funded because people recognise the value of them publicly and the social value of them, and yet then you have documentary films coming through, filmmakers like Michael Moore and Nicholas Philibert, Nick Broomfield, Morgan Spurlock, who prove that yes, you can have commercial success from a documentary film. Can you see a similar sort of situation arising with games of social change?
Yes, definitely. I think, you have the upstream difficulties in the production, you have the downstream difficulties in the sales and distribution. I think in the production challenges lies very much around the gameplay, and I think there are tons of creative game directors out there that can sort of come around that. So I don't see that as the major challenge, even though that's, of course, a significant thing they have to overcome. I think the biggest challenge is in the sales and distribution, and I think as in television, we also in computer games have sort of a bottleneck because everybody's running around after the game publishers that has sort of the huge marketing budgets and the established sales channels. And I think, marketing is extremely important. I think for the games we make and the budgets that we have to be extremely creative in terms of making noise in the public. So, what we did is, of course, we took up the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is highly controversial. That sort of creates some natural media attention. And I think another good thing, or at least in retrospect, I think that was a good thing, we put a journalist sort of as the main character in the game, and that caused a lot of media attention as well. That sort of directed people to us and enabled us to sell through our own channel. So we have sort of direct distribution. We also have publishers, but publishers are extremely risk averse. So I would say we have publishing deals. They're good, not super good, but the best thing for us is definitely to establish a direct sales channel, and I think we need to be very creative to do that.
Two other things too is that there now are, like Microsoft has this new XNA tool that you can make your own games. Most people can. It takes some technical expertise, but and they have revenue sharing. So I think as we start to see some of these new games made in new avenues from the community itself, I think that will show, some of these could really take off. And, the more home, since the publishers are so risk averse. And there are also, in our country, I don't know about you all, but we have, something called the Corporation for Public Gaming that's sort of in the work that, we might be creating a big government-funded area that is specifically for this. So we may have more funding that's, the traditional funding models.
Sorry, to interject. Was one kind of thing, which is a comparison. So if you, there's a friend of mine who runs Warpex, who makes films in Sheffield, so made in England. Don't quote me on the stats, but your mainstream Hollywood big movie gets 140 prints around the country to go around and around all the mainstream multiplexes. The not direct quote, because I'm pretty sure these were the figures. He made 40. There were 40 run prints for This Is England, considered to be one of the most successful independent films of recent times. So it depends. It's scale, and I agree. The problem we have is a distribution channel for this. So that whole kind of I think we've got hell of a lot to learn as an industry from the film and documentary process of events like this. There isn't a gaming event other than GDC, which is for the mainstream education entertainment market. So there needs to be some kind of distribution channel, probably online, for all this kind of stuff. There's a lot going on, but it's not in one place.
There's a very great festival in New York, actually, event. It's the biggest.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's the biggest event in games on the East Coast.
Invite us.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay, we have one from the camera guy at the back. What's your name, camera guy?
Richard.
Hello, Richard.
I was just thinking, our Danish friend who put on the list of like the pros of both documentaries and games. There was one thing that I noticed was missing, which was like emotional response. Like I think documentaries can generate a really strong emotional response. And I'm not a gamer at all. I was just interested whether like games can generate the same, in that, I mean, like obviously you can have tears of frustration, but do they generate tears of empathy?
I'm going to pass this one over to. I can see someone struggling a bit.
Explode. So I have a talk that I do called "Why I Cry at Games," which is exactly about this. You need to put it the other way around. If games are emotionally hollow, how are they entrancing millions of people around the world for tens and thousands of millions of hours? They are getting something from the experience. And there are certainly tears of frustration and occasionally swear words of frustration and sometimes throwing the controller at the wall of frustration. But there is far, far, far more going on. What you find that games can produce are palettes of emotion that aren't open to other entertainment forms. Or education forms or factual forms, because of your own involvement and your complicity in what's happening. That the games industry isn't, the mainstream games industry isn't interested in talking about, and that we're still only at the beginnings of developing a vocabulary for. But I could go from now for the next 24 hours on complex, subtle, evolving emotional experiences that I've had in games that take in all kinds of emotions. From what sometimes in the games industry we end up calling kind of the crude emotions of elation or fright or these kind of big broad brush things, through to really complex elements of kind of melancholy or guilt or loyalty or affection or I have relationships with game characters that have lasted for 20 years. Forget crying at games. I've cried at screenshots. These are people who I've lived with, whose well-being has been my responsibility, who've inspired me and delighted me, who've taken me out of myself, who are my alter egos, who are different parts of my psychology. I mean, it is impossible to overstate the richness, and I will now stop before I go on for 24
Very
hours.
passionate
But
response
yes,
to emotional
in
question
short.
there. Simon, do you want to talk?
With regards to it, because you're obviously trying to, like with these social change things, it's like you've got to engage with, there's that thing that sort of that TV thing that spawned Live Aid when Michael Burke went out to the famine, and it was really a really strong response. I wonder whether like these films that these games about Darfur sort of can generate those same responses.
Simon, do you want to talk about some of the work that you do here, and particularly with Red Mist, and how you're going to explore this area? Or can you talk about that at all?
Talk about it very briefly. One thing we're actually looking at the moment with this technology, the NeuroSky technology, is actually taking those emotions that you're talking about and feeding them back into the game. So it's not necessarily sort of we're talking almost on the flip side of that. But as part of that, there would be we'd be working with youth offenders and presenting them with certain situations in a game environment, and taking information about exactly those sort of, how much they're concentrating on it, if they are sad about things, if they are elated, if they're depressed about bits, and taking that feedback and actually using that as an assessment tool of certain situations from a cognitive perspective. So yes, they do have, we know that games have an effect on people, and that's something we're kind of looking into, so maybe next year.
Okay, one final question. Anyone? Okay, quick sum up from the panel. Quick one-liner. Suzanne?
I just think that there are lots of opportunities for people who are looking to... we have a whole community of people. We have some of the best innovative game designers like Eric Zimmerman and others who are not finding avenues in the mainstream area to innovate. And so they are really happy to partner with us because these game design challenges are very exciting for them. And so we have these teams of people ready to go and make social issue games, and we don't have the funding in our country because, as you know, the US is not particularly good at having arts funding and other things. So I just say that to people who are in the audience who might be, from the
So you
media
welcome
side.
collaborations from people in the UK, wherever. Fantastic. Mikkel?
Well, mine is also going to be sort of an invitation for collaboration. We know sort of the documentary market, or the sort of the niche area only on the surface, but we know the gaming industry pretty good, and I assume that that goes for the documentary people as well. They know their own field good, and that gaming very sort of superficially. So I hope that this has given some kind of indication of the gaming media and what it can do, and I think the way forward in this respect is definitely to try to initiate some kind of closer collaboration. So an open invitation.
Fantastic. Simon, anything to add?
Sort of specifically with relation to the DocFest, we've been approached by a couple of production companies with regard to putting together a documentary about the young people that work on our projects. If there's anyone that's interested in the interesting stories from some of these people, they're youth offenders, they've turned their lives around now, they're making socially responsible games. It's a bit odd. It's an interesting story. Maybe you want to get in touch.
David?
Different media forms have different power. That's what I'd say.
That's a good snapshot. And Margaret?
Really simple. Play more games. There's been an explosion of creativity in the games industry in the last 5 years. There are things out there that you would not have dreamt of, and unless you experience them directly, you will forever be faintly baffled by what on earth we're all dedicating our lives to. So dig in, find stuff, you'll be amazed.
Fantastic. And just from my side, just to let you know that on the funding situation, again, I just flag up the opportunities with 4IP, which is a fund that is very much all about being a catalyst for transforming what you may be used to dealing with in what I'll call traditional media and moving more over into the digital space. So if you're looking to collaborate with any of these companies, and if you're looking for a funding model behind it, then do take a look at 4IP, because that may well be the answer. Finally, thanks very much indeed for my very fantastic and distinguished panel. Thank you for staying the duration, and I hope you found this session enjoyable and informative. And if anyone has got any further questions or wants to speak to any of us, I'm sure that we will, apart from David, be hanging around for the rest of the day. Yeah. So please do come and collar us and find us wherever we may be. Thanks very much.